launch right in to my presentation. And here's how I would like to frame my talk today. What do the writers Lea Goldberg, Jabrā Ibrāhīm Jabrā, and Almog Behar have in common? As translators, they share a central preoccupation with language. In the multilingual crucible of Mandate Palestine and modern Israel, they work against an exclusionary mindset that would subsume all other languages to modern Hebrew. Instead, they embrace a poetics of translation that foregrounds linguistic catholicity and interanimation. With their biographies marked by varying stages of physical or cultural exile, these poets also serve as multilingual cultural viaducts. Here you have a photo collage of Goldberg, Jabrā, and Behar, left to right. So the background for my talk today is an anthology, as Dr. Seidelman mentioned, a project that I've been working on for the past couple of years. And I've also brought some back issues of WLT with me if you'd like to pass those around. These are issues that have dealt with Hebrew, Israeli, and Palestinian literature over the years. And I also brought some trilingual broadsides that WLT commissioned, which features Naomi Shihab Nye's poem Jerusalem translated into Arabic and Hebrew. At the end of my talk, I will give a 3-question quiz to see if you've been paying attention. The first audience members who correctly respond to each question will receive a free copy of the broadside. So since 1927, World Literature Today, OU's award-winning magazine of international literature and culture, has published the work of more than 80,000 byline contributors in nearly 11,000 pages. My anthology, Is There a World Literature, draws from the pages of Books Abroad, which is our previous name for the first 50 years, and WLT over the past century. It is forthcoming from Restless Books in spring 2026 and will serve as the centerpiece of WLT's centennial celebrations. In my introduction to the volume, I analyze how aspects of geography, modernity, storytelling, language, and translation have expanded our definitions of world literature over time. My talk today will draw on my academic background in comparative literature and translation studies, as well as my work as a poet, essayist, editor, and translator, as well as professor. Again, thank you to all my students for coming in today and joining us. I should note that I'm neither a linguist nor a historian, so I only feel qualified to talk about languages here from a literary perspective. I'm also aware that languages can be used as shibboleths, instruments of empire, and purveyors of violence, but that's the subject of an entirely different talk. As some of you may know, Franz Kafka considered immigrating to Palestine late in life and studied Hebrew and Talmud while living in Berlin in the early 1920s. So I'd like to begin with one of my favorite allegories of translation. Here, Kafka rewrites the myth of the Tower of Babel, in which humanity was punished for its audacity by being scattered into multilingualism. In Kafka's parable called The Pit of Babel, the interlocutor asks, "What are you building?" And the narrator responds, "I want to dig a subterranean passage. Some progress must be made. My station up there is much too high. We are digging the pit of Babel." Turning to Israel, Ethnologue lists 36 languages and dialects spoken in the state of Israel. The Semitic language family alone includes Amharic, Arabic, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Tigrinya. Of course, the 2 official languages in the state of Israel are modern Hebrew and Levantine Arabic. English is also widely spoken, as is Russian as a mother tongue by at least 20% of the population, I believe. Other Slavic languages, Amharic and Tigrinya, are Ethiopian immigrant languages from the 1970s to the present, especially Yiddish and German historically, as well as Spanish, Judeo-Spanish, Moroccan Arabic, Neo-Aramaic, and other vernaculars are still spoken by some of the older generations in Israel. Moving east, Romanian, Hungarian, Greek, Judeo-Greek, Turkish, Armenian, Persian. From Central Asia, you have Georgian and Bukhari spoken by some Israelis. And then even from India, Marathi and Malayalam. Here you have a general map of Israel where the cerulean blue, a kind of middle blue, represents Hebrew, white represents Arabic, And the intermediate shades, as you can see, was in the Golan Heights and Galilee in the north represent mixed areas. Worldwide, Arabic is the 5th most spoken language with more than 300 million native speakers, while modern Hebrew is outside the top 100 with some 9 million native speakers. The Levantine Arabic of Israel is also spoken in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and southern Turkey. Modern Hebrew draws on Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi diasporic influences, and more. Before I provide some examples of the poetics of translation, I'd like to share with you a poem by Nizar Qabbani that introduces the metaphor of the suitcase, which reappears frequently in Palestinian exile poetry. Qabbani was a 20th century Syrian diplomat, poet, writer, publisher, and one of the most beloved poets in the Arab world. Almog Behar writes, "I see Qabbani carrying in his suitcases the exiled craft of poetry from Arab city to Arab city." In his poem Language, Qabbani writes, "When a man is in love, how can he use old words? Should a woman desiring her lover lie down with grammarians and linguists? I said nothing to the woman I loved, but gathered love's adjectives into a suitcase and fled from all languages." Beginning with Hebrew. Before I discuss Goldberg, I'd like to quote from an essay by Eitan Levin that will appear in the Centennial Anthology. The essay appeared in the summer 1998 issue of WOT, which included a focus on Hebrew literature in the 1990s to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Israeli statehood. Dr. Levin was a professor of biblical studies at the University of Haifa in Israel. He writes, "One of the most amazing successes of the Jewish national movement was the revival of Hebrew as a spoken living language. The likelihood of success seemed so remote that even Theodor Herzl, the visionary architect of political Zionism, deemed German to be the most appropriate lingua franca for the eventual Judenstaat. Many of the original settlers were of similar opinions, preferring Russian, Yiddish, Turkish, German, or English rather than attempt to breathe life into an archaic language that had long been relegated to the study hall and the synagogue. Yet Hebrew won out, as it had to, and not solely because only Hebrew could provide some linguistic commonality to the settlers coming from widely divergent language communes. Rather, only Hebrew could provide the Zionist enterprise with its spiritual roots, its cultural continuity, and its historical associations. In assimilating Israeli Hebrew, an immigrant must learn to mispronounce English words, adopt Yiddishisms, add Slavic and German diminutives, and intersperse Arabic. Today, as in the past, the single most positive architect of the Hebrew language is the serious writer of poetry and prose." And he goes on to discuss 3 examples: Agnon, the Nobel Prize winner, Abraham Shlonsky, and Amos Oz. I begin with the beloved Lithuanian-born Israeli writer Lea Goldberg. Here we have a photo of her taken when she was 16, on the cusp of leaving to pursue a university education in Berlin. This map shows Lithuania in its immediate geographical context. If you drew a line from Stockholm to Kyiv and another line from Prague to St. Petersburg, they would roughly intersect over Kovno, today known as Kaunas, Goldberg's hometown. According to the Russian census of 1897, about a third of Kovno's population was Jewish, and Russians and Poles made up about half of the city's populace. The region was part of Prussia until 1918. So who was Lea Goldberg? Born in Prussia, she was raised in Lithuania and spoke Russian as her mother tongue, along with Lithuanian, German, Yiddish. And she began writing in Hebrew at Kovno's Hebrew Gymnasium. She eventually received a PhD in Oriental Studies at the University of Bonn in 1933. Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. Of course, so her situation became precarious. She couldn't stay there. She immigrated to Mandate Palestine in 1935, where she lived in Tel Aviv until 1952, then in Jerusalem until her death in 1970. Goldberg co-founded the Department of Comparative Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she was a popular lecturer. As a translator, Goldberg translated works from 7 different languages into Hebrew, including texts by Shakespeare, Petrarch, Molière, Balzac, Stendhal, Tolstoy, Chekhov, Ibsen, Strindberg, and others, which is pretty remarkable. I'd like to share with you a late poem by Goldberg called I Talk to You, read in Hebrew here by her translator, Rachel Tzviabach.
אני דוברת אלייך היום בלשוני, קרנה בהדלפת השם, כאילו עודך מבינה את ליבי העברי, הלא תזכרי את בנייך הפורדים, את מקצב צעדך בלשוני, הלא תזכרי. אברך מפרפר ונחנק בשירי, ומי את לי, ומי לך אני. אנוכי רק ראיתי פה בעוברי, פרפר לבן גדול על פני שער אלהמרה. זורם דם הנחושת ושואב כארי, דם אבותיי במזמור עברי, וזוכרות אבנייך פרש נוכרי. אבל מי את לי ומי לך אני. אנוכי רק ראיתי פה בעוברי, פרפר לבן גדול על פני שער אלהמרה.
In English, I talk to you today in my tongue, lovely named Granada, as though you still know my Hebrew speech. Do you not recollect your stepsons and the rhythm of your gait in my tongue? Do you not recall? Your past flutters and is smothered in my song, for who are you to me and to you, who am I? I only saw here as I was passing by a large white butterfly on the gates of the Alhambra. The blood of bronze flows and roars like the lion of my ancestors' blood in the Hebrew hymn, and your stones remembering a foreign horseman. But who are you to me and to you, who am I? I only saw here as I was passing by a large white butterfly on the gates of the Alhambra. Here we are cast back into the so-called convivencia of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian coexistence in Spain from the 8th to the 15th centuries. Peter Cole's anthology, The Dream of the Poem, gathers a wonderful selection of Hebrew verse written during this period. As Liran Yadgar pointed out to me, Goldberg references Yehuda Halevi's pilgrimage to the Holy Land in his poem, Zion, Jerusalem, have you no greeting for your captive hearts, which is here repeated in the questions, do you not recollect, do you not recall? Goldberg's influence on Israeli literature and world literature by extension, I would characterize it by the fact that she is among one of many translators, especially modern Hebrew writers, Sens Bialik and Trishman and Chernychovsky in the late 19th century were translators, many others as well in the 20th century, Knesset, Rab, Shlonsky, Yeshurun, Ratosh, Altman, Preil, Stern, Schimmel, Ravitkovich, Shabtai, Wieseltier, Shumas, and Masaha. These last two are very prolific translators from and into Arabic and Hebrew both ways, as well as creative writers. Aaron Appelfeld was one of Goldberg's students at HUJ. As a soldier in the 1948 war, Yehuda Amichai carried a book of Goldberg's poetry called On the Flowering in his knapsack. In a poem called Lea Goldberg Died in 1971, Amichai writes, she learned many languages through the driving sadness of man, speech, writing, and quiet weeping. In addition to the primacy of language itself in translation, I'd also like to emphasize the embodied aspect of translation by sharing a passage from the scholar and translator Vivian Eden's review of On the Surface of Silence, the last poems of Lea Goldberg, which is the book from which the poem we just heard is drawn. Dr. Eden writes, the first funeral I went to in Israel was Lea Goldberg's in 1970 in Jerusalem. I'd been one of many students in her first year introductory course in the Department of General and Comparative Literature at Hebrew University, shortly before she became very ill. Jewish funerals I'd experienced in the United States tried to blur the gritty realities of death with canopies, astroturf, and floral arrangements as though for a garden wedding, orderly seating for the chief mourners, closed coffins, and an imposing machine, the Deus ex machina, as a cousin once quipped. to do the dirty work of lowering the closed coffin into the earth in a stately manner. So I was shocked then by the brutal procedure in Israel. The poet's body, wrapped in a simple shroud through which its lumpy outline was visible, was carried to the graveside on an open stretcher and dropped, tipped directly into the freshly dug soil, as the mourners stood around in ragged clusters of luminaries and mere students and admirers, all trying to avoid stepping on other graves until the unamplified ceremony, eulogies, and readings were completed. Though her body was tipped into the earth, her legacy did not fall into the depths. Goldberg is remembered. Her teaching and her other writing, including beloved children's books and some of her poems, including some of her more difficult poems, have been set to music by prominent composers and performers. Everyone can hum them. In her day, she was very much part of the Israeli literary scene, though something of an outlier in the power structure of the first years of the state of Israel, when male poets like Alterman, for example, had political heft. She was a woman who immigrated to Palestine in 1935 and not to a kibbutz, a spinster who lived with her mother and was always a bit dressier than most Israeli women in a twin sets and pearls kind of way. She spoke elegant non-Sabra Hebrew in a husky voice roughened by the many cigarettes she smoked. Arabic. Before I discuss Jabrā, I'd like to share with you a passage from another essay that will appear in the anthology. This one is by Taha Hussein, one of the most influential Egyptian writers and intellectuals of the 20th century, and the leading figure of the Arab Renaissance and modernist movement in the Arab world. Hussein writes, an extraordinary renovation manifested itself in all branches of classic Arabic literature in the 1920s. To analyze that real rebirth of the Arabic letters, it would be necessary first to point out the principal causes. They are three in number. In the first place, must be mentioned that reaction against what was foreign, a reaction which resulted in liberating minds and consciences. Then came the publication, thanks to the progress and amazing extension of printing of classical works of the true Arab period. Finally, one must not underestimate the influence of the translation into Arabic of the great masterpieces of foreign literatures, notably French and English. The translation of Western works yielded their finest fruits only after the Arabs secured that requisite to the existence of all literature, physical and moral liberty. My next example is the Palestinian writer Jabrā Ibrāhīm Jabrā, his self-portrait from 1946, we see here. Geographically, Jabrā's family came from northern Mesopotamia, shown in the upper right-hand corner of this map. He was born in Adana, shown in the upper left, then moved to Bethlehem, and after the Saipho genocide, when an estimated 250,000 Assyrian and Syriac Christians were murdered at the direction of the ruling Ottoman party under Talat Pasha during World War I. This was contemporaneous with the Pasha regime's genocide of an estimated 1 million Armenians and Muslim Kurds, as well as several 100,000 Ottoman Greeks. After Bethlehem, Jabrā lived in Jerusalem until 1948 and settled in Baghdad for the remainder of his life. So you see that counterclockwise circuit here on the map. I should note that he would explicitly reject the label of Israeli writer. So who was Jabrā? Self-identified as Palestinian, Jabrā Ibrāhīm Jabrā was a novelist, short story writer, poet, essayist, translator, editor, critic, screenwriter, professor, music lover, and painter. His family, members of the Syriac Orthodox Church, survived the Saipho genocide and moved from French-occupied Cilicia in northern Mesopotamia, southeastern Turkey, where Jabrā was born, to Bethlehem in British Mandate Palestine in the early 1920s, when he was still very young. At the age of 12, Jabrā moved with his family to Jerusalem, where he continued his education and graduated in 1937 from the Arab College, the highest institution of learning in Palestine during the Mandate. Jabrā won a scholarship to study English literature at Cambridge University, then returned to Jerusalem. After the Nakba in 1948, when the Haganah blew up the Semiramis Hotel next door, he eventually settled in Baghdad and taught there until 1952, converted to Islam, then accepted a 2-year Rockefeller Fellowship to study literary criticism at Harvard University. The Nakba is, of course, the Arabic term for catastrophe relating to 1948. He also translated Jabrā began writing poetry and fiction in English, influenced by Joyce, Lawrence, and Woolf, then switched to Arabic in 1948. He translated many works into Arabic, including Shakespeare's sonnets and major tragedies, Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, and works by Oscar Wilde, T.S. Eliot, and Samuel Beckett, as well as others by Machiavelli, Zola, Maupassant, and Chekhov, all into Arabic. Throughout his life, Jabrā was a staunch proponent of modernizing Arabic and Arab literary culture. Among a vast range of other advocacy work, he worked for the Iraqi Ministry of Culture and contributed to the legendary poetry magazine Shi'ir, based in Beirut. In modern Arabic literature in the West, a lecture he delivered at Oxford, Cambridge, and 3 other British universities in 1968, Jabrā wrote, "Poetry might be condemned as too weak a toy against guns, but in actual fact, it was often as good as dynamite." Jabrā wrote the first draft of the following poem in 1954, just 6 years after the Nakba. Of course, the Faust of German legend makes a deal with the devil, exchanging his soul for unlimited knowledge and worldly pleasures. It's called Soliloquy of a Modern Faust. Books and women and 1,000 enemies and friends, all I have left are their names and faces, which by night attack and then fall back. You expelled me from my country, my column, my support, this tongue and this pen. I have tried them all, institutes and pulpits, temples and graveyards, streets glimmering with glass, and behind the gates, the rulers, the priests, and the prostitutes. Mephisto, are you grinning from ear to ear because the deed I signed in blood lives in your breast pocket? 573,227 soldiers supplied with 723,465 rifles and 36,000 mortars and 24,500 vehicles and 11,345 planes, exalting the name of their country by killing every week 264 men, children, and women who demanded the right to life on the shores and in the hills. 76 nations speaking 42 languages convened to defend human rights and uproot 1 million men, children, and women from their fertile land and thrust them in tents among the rocks under the snow, between one exile and another. Mephisto, do you yet hiss with spite in your laughter? Are you slowing down hell for me or hurling the deed in my face? Prepare to travel. Of my suffering, only the easiest remains. Obviously, this is a bitter post-exile poem that not only criticizes Israel, but also indicts the global community for its silence during the Nakba, even though the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the Genocide Convention, were also declared in 1948. Israel joined the UN in 1949 as a signatory to both agreements and ratified the Genocide Convention in August 1949. By that standard, the UN, OHCHR, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch all accuse Israel of committing genocide in Gaza since 2023. 20 years later, Jabrā wrote an essay called "The Palestinian Exile as Writer" that referred back to the Faust poem. He writes, "In the mid-1950s, I remember talking about the Faust syndrome in Palestinian intellectuals. I wrote a poem entitled Soliloquy of a Modern Faust, the Palestinian as thinker, as collector of books and ideas, as organizer of experience and observation, now making his compact with Mephistopheles in return for action. He will go through the cities of the world, like the night, like the storm, possess Helen and dally with Margaret, ever on the move, driven by a godly lust, by a giant's appetite, finally to demand an apocalypse and involvement in a cataclysmic act. The world might end with a whimper, but exile could only end with a bang." I'd like to conclude my discussion of Jabrā with 2 perspectives on his legacy by Issa Bulata and Roger Allen. Bulata writes, "Without chauvinism, but with deep empathy, Palestine and the struggle of its people figure prominently in Jabrā's works, along with major themes such as the feeling of being besieged and the need for freedom, salvation, and redemption that have occupied other intellectuals concerned with the modern human condition." The second perspective is from an article by Anthony Shadid, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Lebanese-American journalist from Oklahoma City, who tragically died in Syria in 2012. Shadid traveled to Baghdad after Jabrā's house and much of his archive were destroyed by a bomb that targeted the Egyptian embassy in 2010. Shadid quotes the preeminent Arabist Roger Allen, who told him, "Jabrā was a living example of the process of translation, taking one culture and literally carrying it across a cultural divide. and placing it in another culture. 3, the sister languages of Arabic and Hebrew. Our third major writer that I will discuss today is Almog Behar, pictured here. Just situated biographically, Behar was born in 1978 in Netanya, Israel. He is a Hebrew language Mizrahi poet, fiction writer, and essayist. One of his aims is to restore the Arabic tongue to its millennial place in Jewish culture. Behar's family is originally Iraqi on his mother's side and Turkish on his father's. His Jewish grandparents immigrated to Berlin in 1917 and survived the Holocaust by escaping to Denmark. They spoke Baghdadi, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Spanish, and German. He studied philosophy and Hebrew literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and completed his PhD in Hebrew Lit at Tel Aviv University. Behar wants to recuperate the place of various Jewish vernaculars, including Arabic, Aramaic, Yiddish, and Ladino in the Israeli literary canon. For Behar and other Mizrahis, Mizrahiness is really a form of consciousness and not just an ethnic identity. He has translated several American poets into Hebrew, continuing our theme, including Ezra Pound, Wallace Stevens, Tobias Merwin, Sonia Sanchez, and Bob Dylan. In a 2017 interview, Behar discussed Arab Jewishness and Jewish Arabness. Modern Hebrew remembers, he said, a period of Hebrew-Arabic symbiosis, even when the politics of the present is one of separation or of violence. History gives us a very partial story that is connected to a particular national age. Literature is an alternative to that history. I think that for many minority or colonized communities, literature sometimes comes before history by telling the story anew after a long repression or silencing of memory. In the new Hebrew writing issue of WLT that's going around from 2015, we published Behar's essay, Alas, Baghdad Sits Solitary, which included this graphic in Arabrit by a type designer named Liron Lavi Turkenich, which is a hybrid writing system composed of Arabic letters on the upper half and Hebrew letters on the bottom. Here, the characters in the image fuse two words for language. In Hebrew, safa, lip, and Arabic, lua, meaning language. In Behar's best-known story, on Amin al-Yahud, the title in Hebrew renders the Arabic phrase, I'm one of the Jews. In the opening line, Behar references Tammuz, a month in the Babylonian calendar named for the ancient Mesopotamian and Levantine deity associated with agriculture and fertility. A festival for the deity was held throughout the month of Tammuz in midsummer and celebrated his death and resurrection. As many of you know, Tammuz is also a summer month in the Hebrew and Arabic calendars. The story begins. At that time, my tongue twisted around, and with the arrival of the month of Tammuz, the Arabic accent got stuck in my mouth, deep down in my throat. All I have at my disposal is Hebrew with an Arabic accent, and my Arabic, which doesn't come from my home, but from the army, is suddenly mute, strangled from my throat, cursing itself without uttering a word, hanging in the suffocating air of the refuges of my soul, hiding from family members behind the shutters of Hebrew. Next, I'd like to share with you two stanzas from Behar's poem, Sheikh Jarrah 2010, which refers to the legal and political dispute between Palestinians and Israelis over the ownership of certain properties and housing units in East Jerusalem. Behar participated in a demonstration against the eviction of Palestinian families in August 2010. In the poem, he writes, I am a Jew of beard, of glasses, of tea, of a Messiah who will no longer come, of many commandments that for generations I have been promising my heart will fulfill, but I don't succeed, of the remembrance of the sanctity of Arabic words in the Hebrew tongue. We forget that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, forget that there is but one law for us and for the stranger who lives with us, forget that the Hanun family are not strangers in this land, that the Al-Kurd family are not strangers to this land, that the Gawi family are not strangers to this land, and we continue to forget. I'll end with Behar's famous poem, My Arabic is Mute. My Arabic is mute, strangled at the throat, cursing itself without uttering a word, sleeps in the airless shelters of my soul, hiding from relatives behind the Hebrew blinds. And my Hebrew is raging running between rooms and neighbors' balconies, making its voice heard in public, prophesying the coming of God and of bulldozers. And then it holds up in the living room, thinking itself so open in the language of its skin, so hidden between the pages of its flesh. A moment naked, a moment later dressed, it curls up into the armchair and begs itself for forgiveness. My Arabic is petrified. It quietly pretends to be Hebrew and whispers to friends. Whenever somebody knocks at her gate, ahlan, ahlan, welcome. And whenever a policeman passes it in the street, it produces an ID card and points out the protective clause, Anamin al-Yahud, Anamin al-Yahud, I am a Jew, I am a Jew. And my Hebrew is deaf, sometimes very deaf. To conclude, I'd like to pose a question and answer it in part with a passage from an essay that will appear in the Centennial Anthology by the Indian-born poet and essayist Mina Alexander. Alexander was an immigrant to New York and wrote this essay after 9/11. So the question is, why should we care about world literature and the poetics of translation in 2025? In her essay called What Use is Poetry, Alexander writes, in a time of violence, the task of poetry is in some way to reconcile us to our world and to allow us a measure of tenderness and grace with which to exist. I believe this very deeply, and I see it as an effort to enter into the complications of the moment, even if they are violent. But through that, in some measure, poetry's task is to reconcile us to the world, not to accept it at face value or to assent to things that are wrong, but to reconcile one in a larger sense, to return us in love, the province of the imagination, to the scope of our mortal lives. Thank you.